Hello, welcome to This Side of the Ceiling. I'm Kelsey.
And I'm Jill, and we're two good friends trying to live this life on this side of the ceiling as abundantly as Christ has called us to.
We are by no means experts, but we love to study His Word and share everything that He has revealed and taught us.
So come along with us as we open up the scriptures and dive into His wonderful Word. Welcome to This Side of the Ceiling, and you find us in a study of David, a man after God's own heart. But today we want to see, thankfully, that even though David was a man after God's own heart, who loved the Lord and respected Him, God knew that David needed somebody with skin on him to walk with him and be with him through dark times, and He gave him a friend, a really good friend. And David and Jonathan are an example of just a really good friendship in the Lord. It's a sweet story. You know, Proverbs 18:24 says there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And we get some stories about Jonathan and David, and Jonathan really, really loves David. And
right.
and
Loves the Lord, we found out.
Yeah, that's right. You know, and we think about as we've been studying David, we see that in a lot of ways he's kind of, in the Bible, points to him as kind of the first king of another king that's coming in the New Testament that's from Bethlehem and that's going to be king. And so David is the forerunner of Jesus. Jesus even says he's part of David's family. So if David is kind of supposed to look like King Jesus,
Right.
then Jonathan is going to show us what it looks like to love Jesus with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is what the greatest commandment is. Before I think you're going to talk to us about that relationship a little bit, we can look at a little bit, though. I want to read 5 verses of 1 Samuel 18 because it tells you a little bit about how Jonathan felt about David. 1 Samuel 18, first 5 verses say, this, and I should say that this is right after Goliath, the story of Goliath. So apparently Jonathan is right there, and he has watched all of that. He has seen what David has done, and he's
Saul's son.
He's Saul's son, and so he's probably in the room when David is playing his instruments for his father at times. So he has come to know David. And so chapter 18, verse 1 says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let David return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So we see that Jonathan, it says, loved David as himself twice. Right. Yeah. And he gives him some gifts. He gives him his robe and mentions several pieces of his armor. And, you know, his robe, all of the soldiers had armor, but only his robe was a princely robe. Yeah, it was the prince's robe. And so that represented the privileges he had as a son of the king. And he gives those privileges to David. And he gives him his armor, which is his position. And he has his blessings. Go use this. You're the rightful person. And we see that. Before we get into more of what David and Jonathan's relationship was about, I want to go back to, I don't want to just think about, who is this Jonathan? You know, what is it? Because something in his spirit connected with David's spirit. And I think it was God. The spirit inside of them connected with each other because they saw that same spirit. There's one story about Jonathan that we read, and it's back in 1 Samuel 14. But it's before David comes on the scene, but I think it gives us a little bit of a picture of who Jonathan is. Jonathan, now I'm going back, so he's got that armor on himself, and he is with Saul, and they're out fighting the Philistines, and he has an armor bearer. And an armor bearer in the Old Testament was someone that was known for their courage, and the king or the general would choose this worthy person to go with him and carry the weapons he might need in battle. I think you said it's kind of like a caddy, you know? Yeah, and I think it would be someone that you could talk about, what do I need to use here? And someone that was going to be with you in the battle, and their job is to protect you and to carry the things, your big shield and the things that you would need. And possibly to go before you maybe, or be with you in that battle. So Jonathan is there and Jonathan says to his armor bearer, let's go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side, but don't tell my father. And Jonathan wants to go and go look over where all these Philistines are, kind of sneak over there. And so I'm in 1 Samuel chapter 14:6. It says, Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of those uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. And the armor bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish, because I am with you, heart and soul. So we just heard Jonathan say to David, I love you, I'm with you with all my heart as my own soul. These are kind of those words that the armor bearer is saying to Jonathan. And Jonathan, we see a little bit of his relationship of how he thinks about the Lord. What is it that I've heard often that your view of the Lord will determine your response to him.
Right.
And so here we see a very big response from Jonathan.
Very bold.
It's bold. And because he says, it may be, so he's not forcing God to do it, but then he says, but he could.
Yeah.
He could do it. He doesn't need a big army. He can do what he wants to.
Right.
So we see Jonathan saying that that God is sovereign. He can do this if he wants to. And if he chooses not to, it's not because he's weak.
Right.
It's just because he chooses not to. And so the armor bearer goes with him heart and soul. And what Jonathan says, so Jonathan goes up and he tells the armor bearer to follow him, which I think is interesting too. And so Jonathan says to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. They come up with this little plan of how they're going to know if they should go or not. And turns out they should go. And so Jonathan says, you follow me. Sometimes I think maybe the armor bearer went in front of him, but Jonathan says, you follow me. And they go and they have a big victory. And so I think we see a little bit into Jonathan's heart there. And just kind of a side note, I think it's very interesting because in the New Testament, God tells us to put on the armor of God in Ephesians 6, which in essence, we become God's armor bearers.
Yeah.
We become wearing the armor, and we don't just bear it, we wear it.
Right.
And in this case, Jonathan says, follow me, and the armor bearer follows him. And I think God tells us, put on my armor and follow me. Follow me into the battle. So I think that's a neat picture, when Galatians 6 tells us all of it's not our armor, it's God's armor, the belt of truth, the shield of faith, and the sword of the Spirit, all those pieces. Yeah, all of that. And so I think that's interesting to think about being an armor bearer for God, the way that this armor bearer was loyal to Jonathan. And we see that Jonathan, he had faith. And so I think that I personally think that's what connected him to the heart of David.
Right, yeah. And, they had a special relationship. And
Jonathan, we see Jonathan be loyal to David in 1 Samuel 20.
And I think too, he's loyal, and he was the rightful supposed to be the next king.
Right.
And so, that's a big deal because Jonathan recognizes that David is God's anointed future king, not him.
Right.
Most people today would see that as a threat to your future, but Jonathan willingly confers the right to the throne to David.
Yeah, because Jonathan trusts God. Jonathan knows that God is sovereign and that he trusts God's plan. And Jonathan's good with God's plan. And so he and David become great friends. And like you said, he's the person, he's David's person that God gives him to help him. And in 1 Samuel 20, David is now knowing that Saul is against him. Saul is trying to kill him. But Jonathan doesn't believe it, which I think kind of shows Jonathan's personality. Like, no, that's not true. When David starts saying, your father's after me, and Jonathan, in 1 Samuel 20, verse 2, he says, never, Jonathan replied, you are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without confiding in me. Why would he hide this from me? It's not so.
Jonathan thinks it's going to all work out.
Yeah.
He wants David to be king, but he also sees himself right beside him.
Yeah, and I think he trusts his father.
He's caught.
He wants to love his father, and he wants to believe his father. But then he also puts God and God's plan and David above that in a good way. So then it says, then in verse 3 in chapter 20, but David took an oath and said, your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he has said to himself, Jonathan must not know this, or he will be grieved. Yet as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, there is only one step between me and death. Jonathan said to David, whatever you want me to do, I'll do for you. So you hear David pour out his heart to Jonathan, and you hear Jonathan is loyal. He's going to stay loyal to David because he knows God is on David's side.
Right.
And they have that connection in the Lord. And
he's made a covenant with him.
Mm-hmm. And it says, then David has this plan of, okay, I'm going to show you that he's against me. And so David says, so tomorrow there's going to be a festival and I'm not going to show up. And so the plan is, Jonathan, for you to tell your father, or when your father asks about me, then tell him that I have gone to Bethlehem. So he's asked permission to go to Bethlehem because his family is observing a sacrifice in the town, and his brother has ordered him to be there. If I have favor in your eyes, let me get away to see my brothers. And so that's Jonathan's story when Saul asks about David, which I think is interesting that David says, Saul's going to miss me if I'm not there. Because, a man after God's own heart, their actions are very predictable. His personal life has stability.
That's
in
true.
it.
That's really true.
And he's a man of
integrity,
structure, integrity, consistency. And so David knows that he's that kind of man and that Saul's going to miss him because he should be there. And so David's life is very predictable. So I think David, by that statement, David knowing that Saul will miss him, that David's habits are building him into a man after God's own heart.
Oh, that's so true.
Yeah.
And our habits need to be consistent because they're building us into that.
Well, and I know over the years, little bit of knowledge or a little bit of aha moments over years and years and years of time, because you are faithful and you are studying and you are praying, it just builds, and it builds who you are,
right.
And it becomes who you are. Just those little steps every day become who you are.
Yeah, it's those little adjustments. It's like when you're driving. If you were to correct really fast, it throws you,
Mm-hmm.
It's those little tiny adjustments that you make that keep you on the road.
Yeah, and David knew that his habits were someone that would have been there at the festival. And so David says there should be no anger in Saul when he gives this excuse. And that is not what happened.
Yeah.
So David's not there. They form this plan of how to tell David if Saul gets mad, because David's not going to be there, and Jonathan has to kind of hide the message. And so they have this plan with this boy shooting arrows. And so it says in verse 30, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan when Jonathan gave him this excuse of why David's not there. So he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he must die." And so Jonathan, I'm sure, wide-eyed, hears the real Saul. And I don't know, the way Jonathan answered David, I think this might be the first time he hears the real voice of Saul.
Well, yeah, he has been a little bit ignoring that. I mean, because even in the story that I read about the armor bearer, after that, Saul tries to kill Jonathan because he made some crazy oath that they can't eat that Jonathan didn't hear, and he eats some honey, and so Saul's like, okay, we got to kill Jonathan. And all the men rise up and say, we're not killing Jonathan. He just saved us.
Yeah.
And so Saul is rash.
Yeah. And, Saul acts like, I want you to be the king.
Yes.
Not David. I want my lineage to carry on.
That's another strength of character of Jonathan, because it is hard. Like you said, he wants to believe the best about his dad. He wants to think he can talk his dad into doing the right thing. And at some point he has to choose, and he chooses the right thing.
Right. Yeah, he chooses God's plan. And then he asks his dad, why should he be put to death? What has he done? But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger. On that second day of the month he did not eat, because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David. And that's when they had the small boy and they gave the message. And so they're going to part.
Yeah.
Because they know the real plan, they know what's going to happen and how Saul is going to chase David. So after the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. So I think that is interesting, too, that David wept the most.
Yeah, why do you think that?
I just think he was a true friend, that he was weeping because his friend had to go in a different direction.
And I think also he had to know that it's not going to end well for Jonathan, because if you have the son of a king that is alive, then you're going to have some people that want the son of, that's the rightful heir.
Right.
And so when this break has now been, it's not going to be nice, then David knows not only does it mean they don't get to be together but as friends, but it's probably not going to go well for Jonathan either.
Yeah.
And it doesn't,
Right. Yeah. But I do think, I love this story, that I love the loyalty Jonathan has, not only to David, but to God's plan.
Right.
He's okay not being the king.
Yes.
And he's okay with saying goodbye to David because he's wanting to protect him. And so I do think God gives us those people.
Yeah. We see that in other times in the Bible. God gives Mary Elizabeth
Right.
when she's a young, very, very young.
Scared.
Yeah, scared, pregnant, the talk of the town. And God sends her to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is so excited. And we know that Mary felt that because immediately she breaks into song and sings that Magnificat that we all.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and God gave Ruth Naomi, or I guess Naomi Ruth. So God provides those friendships for us.
Yeah, there's one other place in the Bible that I think is real sweet, is when Jesus is dying on the cross. In John, it tells us that it's naming the women at the cross, which other Gospels do too. But in John, it's naming the women. It says Mary and her sister was with her. And I thought, how sweet that God knew that on probably the hardest day of Mary's got to stand. I can't imagine her standing there watching her son be crucified. You would want to be there for him, but that had to be so painful. And yet God gave her sister to stand beside her. I think that's very sweet of God to do that.
Yeah, and I can remember times where I'm struggling and God gave me you.
Oh,
And how you would just, put your arm around me and we'd say a prayer, and it would just calms your spirit just to know you have someone that understands.
I think that's so true. I would say could say the same thing about you. I think about, my husband's parents divorced when he was little, and the day that his dad came to gather his stuff and leave the house, Brooks didn't want to see that. He was hurting. And so he climbed up on the roof of the house so that he could not be there. But he wasn't alone. His best friend was sitting right beside him. And Brooks never forgot that.
Right.
That will be his best friend forever because of that moment. So I think it is very sweet, and there's lots we can learn about Jonathan and David. Jonathan is dies to himself, very humble, very, like you said, accepts God's plan and fights for it.
Right. Yeah.
And so they shared a special relationship, and one we can learn a lot from.
Thanks for listening and journeying with us on this side of the ceiling. See you next time.